Aaron or hard. You're listening to NativeTalk.net radio podcast. Our conversations are never tested on animals. Now grab your nets and let's go fishing.
Welcome back to the NativeTalk.net radio podcast. If you want to drop us a line, voice message, you can call in 970-278-5791 or email us podcast@nativetalk.net as I continue with Danelle Reed about firearm safety. Now, explain to me suicide. This is your forte. This is something that you studied and you understand. What causes somebody to just take their own life? Like, do they just say, do they really say, I just can't live anymore, I want to die?
They certainly will and have in situations verbalize. They will verbalize. They no longer want to be in a world if it includes the emotional suffering that they have. That's for somebody who can find those words and the like. So oftentimes they won't say that though, but they're having those thoughts. It ends up being kind of a Mazatov cocktail of a lot of things happening for most people. It's they might have social circumstances that they're struggling with, whether it's financial or, maybe in their relationships they're struggling. Maybe their children are difficult to manage, and homelessness. It can be a lot. And then again, just that not having the emotional strength, and feeling that hopelessness or helplessness that things won't change. And they don't have the resources or the support too, so it's most often a combination of a lot of those things that will lead, it's become epidemic across the world. It's an epidemic of a reason for death, that people are more and more finding themselves in moments of despair where their only way out that they can see to end that feeling that's so overwhelming is by death. And we want to change that. We want to change people's perception of that, in that, support is there for you. We are there for you. And, to reach out for that help, because most suicidal crises are very short. They're short-lived.
Yeah. And I think what you're describing here to me sounds like something that almost all of us have experienced a situation like that at one time or another. And even, you get a breakup or you're going through the loss of a job, and everybody's felt like, well, life just sucks, and I wish that I didn't have to go through this. And so for me, whenever I've come up against that, I've always said to myself, there's a way out of this. There's always a way out. It just takes time. It takes a lot of work. But in that moment, what I've always done is, I think it's normal to withdraw and kind of take yourself out of society for a little bit, watch a lot of TV. I do a lot of time-consuming activities. I start categorizing like everything in my house, working on like my music collection, just stuff to keep myself busy. And I found that if you give yourself time, you can like formulate a plan, set goals, and work on, getting things started again. And
yes. And I think that's great, Clifton. And I think in a suicide crisis, time is our worst enemy. So what happens is that a suicide crisis, oftentimes when it is completed, it's impulsive. So so we don't have, so that time isn't there, in the as short as just a few minutes, if somebody has access to that gun. So this is why we did a gun lock giveaway here in our community, is if we can lock that gun up, and people are like, well, they can just unlock the gun. Actually, in that moment, in the minutes that it takes to find the keys, unlock it, their contemplation of suicide is being questioned. And so it is, and it actually does save lives, because if that moment of contemplation isn't there, and we often encourage people to put the keys separate with a loved one who can manage them, especially if they're suffering from depression or the like, because then that contemplation and the access to that gun is lengthened.
Because as I'm reading, suicide attempts, as you mentioned, are very impulsive, triggered by like that crisis right now. And so if you've got a time to just think about it. Now, those suicidal impulses are often like really intense. You know, you're feeling it in that moment, but they only last a short period of time. You said sometimes just a couple of minutes. Now, I've got a stat here that I found was quite interesting, if I can get to. Okay, so a quarter of people who are contemplating suicide and they're ready to do it, a full quarter, the time between their decision and their attempt is less than 5 minutes. Half of them is less than 20 minutes, and just over 70% is within an hour. So if you can get beyond that hour, you're only left with 29% of folks who are even going to attempt that.
Right.
And
exactly.
Half of them is less than 20 minutes.
Yes. So that would result, I mean, having that time, having that distance, having the distance from the access really can save, I mean, we're talking in the hundreds of thousands, if not, millions of people a year. Because we know that while
according to this, we've got 20,000 gun suicides every year. So
how many?
20,000.
Okay, so 20,000, and that only represents 6% of the attempts in our country is by gun, but it represents 54% of the deaths. So it's a highly lethal means of taking your life.
I was reading more than that. Two-thirds of more than half of suicides and 2/3 of all gun deaths. That's what it is. So all gun deaths, 2/3 are suicides.
Yes.
And half of all suicides are by gun.
Yes. Yeah, that's right. So do the numbers in terms of you just stated how many people die by gun death suicide, and that's only 6% of our attempters. So we have a lot of people who are suffering with suicide. I've had suicidal thoughts. It's very common. And you've had moments of at least despair where it's like, my life is sucking right now. But having that time to be able to stretch it out and go, okay, I can work myself through this. Tomorrow I can, do this, and this. We need to remove them from that crisis and, so that we can save them.
Yeah. And one of the things that I've always done is since I was a young kid, I've always engaged in goal setting. I understand that the situation I'm in is terrible. It sucks. But I say, here's where I am. And I try to identify where I want to be, right? You set goals. And then you start to think about, well, how am I going to get from here to there? And if you're like trying to be proactive, you start to make decisions today, which will day by day push you forward to where you want to be. And pretty soon you find out, hey, things are pretty good. You're not going to stay in that moment of despair forever. It just doesn't last.
Right.
A lot of people can't see that if they're not engaging in goal setting behavior, So, and that's why they're going to go to guns.
I mean, absolutely, because goal setting is a future-oriented thinking, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, in order to set goals, you need to be able to see that I can affect change in that future-oriented plan. And when somebody is depressed and they're hopeless and helpless, they're living in the here and now and feeling like crud. I mean, they're not even looking 5 minutes from now or a day from now or 1 year from now.
Yeah, they're only looking at
that feeling. That feeling is got them stuck.
Now, here's something interesting I saw. Okay. There are differences between, so you got suicide attempts, but not every suicide attempt is fatal, right? So in non-fatal suicide attempts, these are people who tried, but they didn't succeed. 55% of them are poisoning, so that's not always successful. Cutting or piercing is only 21% of those are non-fatal, and 20% of like other types. Non-fatal is only 0.8% if you try a gun. So chances are, if you use a gun, you're going to be successful. Fatal suicide attempts, half of all attempts that are successful are from a gun, 25% is suffocation. What are people suffocating themselves with? Is that like hanging?
Oh, that's hanging. Yeah. And we actually do try to, in the suicide prevention world, we try not to call somebody dying by suicide a success, because we really all are losing in that, because the person has died. And
well, yeah, that's not a success.
So we like to say, well, we prefer to say, death by suicide or death by gun by,
yeah,
like self-inflicted gun wound, and the like. Yeah.
The way it's labeled is a fatal suicide versus a non-fatal suicide. Yeah. They didn't really call it.
And that's more accurate. And I think we don't use that language because it's uncomfortable, right? To say I lost a nephew to a self-inflicted gunshot wound. He shot himself in the head. Makes people uncomfortable, right? Or even if I said I lost my nephew because he committed suicide. That's another. That's like Do we
want people to be comfortable with suicide, though?
What's that?
I said, do we want people to be comfortable with suicide? I don't think so.
No, well, we don't. But I think part of we talked about stigma last time we got together. And a lot of people in the world don't like to be uncomfortable and aren't comfortable talking about feelings, because of the way we were raised or messages we get in the media. It's been taboo. And that's why I think people suffer. I mean, we had our the most recent well-known suicide death happened just yesterday. I don't know if you heard.
Kate Spade.
Right. And so people will look at her and go, how on earth? She had everything going for her. And that's why it is so complicated. I mean, she was probably one of the top designers in the world, living in, supposedly New York, Manhattan is,
it's there, huh?
Supposed to be great. Right?
I couldn't stand living in Manhattan. If I was in Manhattan, I would be depressed, but
you might like it though. I don't know. People, because millions of people live in Manhattan.
A lot of people like it. I'm just not one of them.
Yeah, if you're city folk.
Yeah.
But that's what makes it so complicated, is that we end up with,
she had everything. What could her problems have been? I don't even know.
Yeah, both you and I could agree, and I'm not I don't follow fashion, but I know her, and I know she's well known and a millionaire and all kinds of, it's just, that's what makes the human condition so, I went into it because it's interesting, right? But yeah, because the human condition it's complicated, and it's, we're all individuals, to the extreme.
But the thing about it though is, with all of the violence, the majority of the violence in this country is self-inflicted, and that's something that's not really talked about because of what you're talking about. People just don't want to feel uncomfortable, and it's hard to talk about these things. But maybe that's why a national study shows that fewer than half, 39% of households with children, store their guns unloaded and locked. So you've got 40% of them who are locking up their guns. You know what I mean?
And that's frightening to me.
It's scary.
60% are not. And so to me, that's not controlling your own personal property. I lock my car every day when I come in my house.
Exactly.
My car gets locked. Yours does, right? You lock your car. So why wouldn't we lock our gun?
With 2 million children, 2 million children living in homes with unlocked and loaded firearms, it's not just a suicide that you've got to worry about at this point. It's an accident. Because accidents happen with guns. It's one of those things that in a second, it can be over, And if you limit the availability, you're going to have fewer accidents, fewer people committing suicide, fewer people who are what was I reading? That in domestic violence situations, women are 5 times more likely to die in a home that has a gun because the man gets angry, he grabs it, shoots her, it's all over.
Exactly.
But
it's true. Having access when somebody is suffering, whether it's with anger, uncontrolled anger, with the hopelessness or the helplessness, and or any intoxicating substance like alcohol or methamphetamines or cocaine, any of those agitating or depressing drugs are, it's a lethal combination.
But you go to my safe, and I've got one of those big, combination locks. It's got 4 numbers that you got to get like this way just right, turn it 3 times that way, 2 times this way. And so, imagine if I'm one of these people who is prone to abuse, prone to anger. I might think, oh, I'm so angry at you, I'm going to kill my wife. But if I've got to go to the safe and put in these, 4 numbers, it's a process. I can't get that thing unlocked in less than 30 seconds. That may be enough time to calm me down,
I mean, that whole time you're having to consider the consequence of use of that gun, right? Whereas if you just had it on the ready and you could just whip it, out of your back pocket, you're going to use it in that time of high emotional distress. And you're going to have to calm yourself down enough to get those 4 numbers right.
One of the things that I've always heard people say is if you're determined to kill yourself, it's going to happen. It's the same argument of, crazy criminals. They're going to find a way to commit their crimes. But we also know that 90% of people who attempt suicide and they fail at it, they don't die. 90% of them don't go on to try it again, So it's a one-time thing more often than not. So if you can just put time between them. And I was reading that if you've got whether you're talking hanging or poisoning or things like this, you've got time for somebody to find you. It doesn't happen instantaneously the way a gun does. So
exactly. That's exactly right. And I'm glad you shared that statistics because for when we are able to come back and interview the survivors of a suicide attempt, more than 9 out of 10, so greater than 90% of them would say that the moment they attempted to take their life, whatever the means, because we do have a few survivors of even, like a gun attempt, they will say in that moment where they're executing the attempt, and then it's past. So like, let's say jumping off of a bridge or an overpass and they've survived that attempt. The minute they have jumped off or pulled that trigger, they wish they hadn't. They regret the attempt. So again, time is our greatest enemy in a suicide crisis, and
we're a friend.
Want to draw that out as much as we can
draw it out. That's our friend.
Yes. Yep.
So here's my question. Every time something happens in the news, everybody's talking about all of these gun control stuff that with everything we see, it's not stopping or preventing violent crime, but nobody's talking about what it does to suicide rates, which to me seems like a much more compelling argument.
Yeah.
What it seems like to me.
Well, and I agree with you. I'm convinced. I think, again, maybe it's that let's not bring something up that people are uncomfortable with. I don't know, but the statistics certainly are far more compelling, like you said, than, let's say, the number of children who died by gun violence last year in America was how many? It was by gunfire was 6,000. I mean, it was in the thousands.
No, we had. Let me see.
I have a statistic on children. Let me see. Where is it?
Yeah, I've got it. It's like 33,000 total gun deaths, and like 2/3 of them, about 20,000, are suicides.
Yeah, and then some percentage of that is children. And those numbers, are far less compelling than the number of people we're losing by suicide. So I think we should throw that in the mix in terms of arguing for a change, and again, it's not taking them away. We've already kind of talked about gun control, but we need to maybe think outside the box and
lock them up. That's like the easiest, most simplest way to stop a lot of this stuff, because you can control your own guns in your own house. Lock them up. Right. It's so simple. Nobody has to come take your guns away. All you have to do is make them harder to get in that moment.
Yes.
And that's something that we don't need any laws for. What I'd like to see? I'd like to see laws that if you've got a suicide or a crime or something happens in a gun or in a house with a gun that's unsecured, we should ramp up the criminal prosecution for that. Because if you do it, you're going to get a lot of people who say, well, I don't want to be prosecuted, just to have a gun unlocked, make that illegal. You know what
I mean? There's a thought right there. Unless people would consider having a gun, because they have to consider, are they truly responsible to have it? And do they want to suffer the consequences, right? I mean, I when I was younger, I probably didn't do this 100% consistently. So I'm admitting some fault here. But nobody's perfect. I do not drink and drive because I don't want to.
That's good.
I don't want to end up in jail for a DUI, but other people don't make that same decision, but there's laws to back that bad decision up.
Exactly.
So let's get the laws to back up.
And all you got to do, and it doesn't limit guns. It doesn't stop guns from, being the ability to own. It doesn't infringe on the Second Amendment just to say, hey, if you have a gun, it's a law that it must be secure. That's all you got to do. And you're going to get responsible, good people who are going to secure those guns in their homes.
Yeah, I think it's
I would
something we should consider.
Because most of us are good law-abiding citizens who aren't interested or would never go commit violent crimes, as we talked about. It's on its way down. People are doing things less, but accidents and self-harm don't seem to be, they seem to be going up.
Right.
Which means that our overall gun deaths are staying stagnant, because while intentional stuff against other people is going down, suicide's going up. So, I don't know. We got a problem, and I wish somebody would do something about it.
Me too.
But look, the one thing that I'm hanging on to is this kind of the things that are happening in the news and all the stuff that's happening. It cannot keep continuing without people rising up and say enough is enough. Something's got to be done, and there's got to be some kind of an answer that will make everybody at least somewhat happy. Something that's actually going to affect real change. So, I don't know.
I agree. I think in November we might see some change and some shifts in some seats after the most recent tragedy that happened in Florida, that school shooting, and they're asking for restrictions on assault rifles and really their weapons of war, and I'm not sure civilians need to own those things.
Do you know how fun those are? I own an AR-15. That thing is the greatest to go shoot.
No, I've never seen one outside of a TV screen.
They're fun.
But I would say, we have to give, and I certainly hold my hands up to the young people who really emboldened a generation to show up and tell our lawmakers, on the lawn in DC back in March when they did the No More, was it No More, right?
Something like that.
That march to say, we need change in how we manage and handle guns in our country. That's what their message was. They don't want to see any more children dying by guns in our country.
And I think that we can all agree with that. I may disagree with some of the things that they stand for, like the ways, but their message is like, their message. You can argue with that.
It is a duh. It's kind of a duh, right?
Right.
And I can get behind that message, though. I mean, it's simple.
Well,
we don't want children dying by gun anymore.
And we got to stop that. So that's all the time we got for today. I want to thank everybody for listening. We'll be back next week with more stimulating Native Talk Radio, available online at nativetalk.net. Make sure you check out our Facebook page, facebook.com/Native Talk Radio. Have a great day. We'll see you guys next week.
This is nativetalk.net radio podcast. When severe weather threatens,
after a roller coaster winter, we're looking ahead to what spring has in store.
A global superstorm developing off towards the Atlantic Ocean.
Run like hell and be sure to take us with you. And grab your nets so we can go fishing.